There was one chair too few in the morning room at Wexham Priors, and everybody in that house knew whose it was. It had not been taken away in temper. Nothing at Wexham Priors was ever done in temper. The chairs had been counted in the first month after Nell Ferrers came to live there, and the count came out a chair over the number of Dallimores in the house, and so the odd chair went quietly up to the box room, above the back stair, where it stood for 4 years under a dust sheet, with a cracked flower pot on the seat of it. Nell knew it was there. She had put the flower pot on it herself, on an errand, without letting herself think anything at all about what she was doing. She was 23 that spring. Her father had been the parson at Aldenbury, a mild, untidy, well-liked man who preached badly and sat up all night with dying people. And when he died, the parsonage was emptied in 11 days for the man who came after him. There was a little money, and then there was less, and then there was an afternoon in a solicitor's office at Norwich where Nell learned that what her father had left her would keep her in coals and stockings and nothing else. Her aunt by marriage had come for her in a closed carriage. It is important to be fair to Mrs. Augusta Dallimore, because the whole of that spring is unintelligible if you make her a monster. She had no obligation in the world to take her dead husband's niece in, and she did it inside a fortnight of the funeral, without being asked. She was a handsome, upright, dry-voiced woman of 50-odd, who had buried a husband and 2 infants, and built out of what was left a position in that county that nobody questioned. She had never in her life been rude to anybody, and she had ruined at least 3 people with her manner alone. What she said to Nell on the second day was this: "You are not to be a burden, and you are not to be a spectacle. Do the first, and I shall be sorry. Do the second, and I shall not forgive you." Nell was 19 then, and did not entirely understand it. She understood it perfectly by the spring this story happens in. Being no burden meant rising before the housemaids, because a woman who is up early is not being kept. It meant writing her aunt's letters, teaching Georgie his Latin, Georgie being the youngest Dallimore and 11 years old and not clever, copying the household book, taking the medicine basket down to the cottages in weather that kept the carriage in, and sitting up whole nights with any servant in that house who was ill, which she did so often and so quietly that the kitchen had stopped regarding her as a lady at all, and treated her with the rough fondness they kept for a good horse. Being no spectacle was simpler. It meant not being in the room. She had grown so accomplished at it that she could come into the drawing-room, cross behind the sofa, take up a work-basket, and go out again while a conversation about the price of a curate went on over her head without a break in it. She had a bedroom on the attic floor, 3rd door, with a window that would not open in summer and would not close in winter. She had a single good gown, dark green, made over twice, a hairbrush of her mother's, and a small watercolor of the church at Aldenbury, painted by a woman she could not remember. And she was, in a way nobody at Wexham Priors had any use for, extremely good at certain things. She could read aloud for 2 hours without her voice tiring, and she read as though she believed what was on the page. Sick people were not frightened of her, and neither were children. She had a way of standing quite still that let a frightened person come back to himself in his own time, and she had never once been thanked for it, because a thing done without noise is not seen to have been done. Her cousin Sophia was 20 and beautiful, the sort of beauty that alters a room. She had her mother's straight back and none of her mother's patience, and she had been told what she was for since she was 12 years old. Because there was a promise on the Dallimores, Nell had it in pieces from the servants and in a long, cold paragraph from her aunt. Old Mr. Dallimore, Sophia's father, dead now these 6 years, had been in trade before he was in land, and cleverer than the men who laughed at him for it. Somewhere in the bad years, the late Duke of Marchbourne had come to him. Nothing was written down in any way a court would care about, but the county knew the shape of it. Marchbourne Court had been within a week of going. A Dallimore had stood behind it, and the old Duke had given his word at his own table that the houses should be joined. Then the old Duke died, and his elder son died, which nobody had expected, and the title went sideways to a younger brother who had been living in Rome and doing nothing in particular, and that younger brother, being now the Duke of Marchbourne, had let it be known that he considered his father's word to be his own. So it was settled, and the county had known it for years and had grown almost bored of knowing it. The letter came on the last Thursday in February. Nell was in the morning room with the household book when Cleghorn brought it in on the salver, and she watched her aunt read it standing up, which her aunt never did, and watched her aunt's face do absolutely nothing at all, which was the tell. "The Duke of Marchbourne," said Mrs. Dallimore, "will call on Tuesday. He proposes to remain in the country until the wedding. He will dine here twice in the week." Sophia, at the window, said, "How very lively of him," in a voice with a crack running through the middle of it. Her mother did not appear to hear that. She had already turned, and was looking at Nell in the level, unhurried, entirely courteous way that always came just before an instruction. "You will keep to the schoolroom while he is in this house. You will not use the front stairs. There will be no place laid for you at any table he sits at, and you will not be sorry about it, because sorrow shows." "Yes, ma'am," said Nell. "It is not unkindness. No, ma'am. It is that a duke who has been made to marry is a duke looking for a reason to be displeased, and I will not have him find it in a poor relation on the stairs." That was the whole of it, and it was not on its own terms unreasonable. Nell went upstairs and spent the rest of that day copying invitations in her small, clear hand, 30 of them, to every family in that part of the county, for the betrothal supper at Marchbourne Court on the last Friday in April, 5 days before the wedding. She wrote out every name. She was careful with the spelling. She was not on the list, and it did not occur to her to mind, and that is the part I want you to hold on to, because everything that comes afterwards is built on it. Tuesday the 2nd of March came in grey and wet, with a wind off the flats that took the smoke sideways off every chimney between Aldenbury and the sea. The house had been at work on that Tuesday since the Thursday before. The hall floor had been done twice. There were forced narcissus in the blue jars. Sophia had been sewn into a gown of pale blush silk that made her look like the inside of a shell, and had been crying at some point in the morning, and had had the marks of it taken off her face with cold water and a hard flannel by her own mother, without a word passing between them. Nell was to be in the schoolroom. She was in the schoolroom. Georgie was at the table with his Latin in front of him, and his ears going red, because Georgie always went red when a carriage came, and at 20 minutes past 2 a carriage came. What happened next was nobody's fault, which is the only kind of accident that changes anything. Georgie had a nosebleed. He had them twice a week that winter, sudden and harmless, and the rule in the house was that somebody fetched the key from the cold larder to hold against the back of his neck. Nell went for the key. Georgie, full of a house worth of tension he did not understand, panicked at the sight of his own hand and ran, not up, not to the back stair, but straight out of the schoolroom door and down the front staircase into the hall, bleeding freely. At the precise moment that Cleghorn opened the door to the Duke of Marchbourne. So Nell came down the front stairs after him. There was no other thing she could have done, and afterwards she remembered the whole of it in hard, bright detail. The cold of the larder key in her fist, the rain smell at the open door, her aunt's face, Sophia's face, and a tall man in a wet dark coat just inside the threshold, with his hat still in his hand. She got hold of Georgie in the middle of the hall floor and put the key to the back of his neck and tipped his head, and she did not look at anybody. And she said, "That's all it is. Hold on to my wrist. Breathe out slowly and count the bricks in the fireplace, and don't help me. I've got you." The hall was silent for what felt to Nell like an extremely long time, and was probably a moment and a half. Then Mrs. Dallimore said, "Your Grace, forgive us. Nell, take him upstairs." And the Duke of Marchbourne, who had not yet been announced, who had not spoken, and who was still holding his hat, put it down on the hall table and stood aside from the door to let a poor relation and a bleeding child go up the stairs in front of him. And when Nell came past him, he did not merely step back. He inclined his head to her, as if she had come into a room. She went up with Georgie and got the bleeding stopped and washed his collar in cold water herself, and then sat on the schoolroom floor for a while with her back against the leg of the table and her hands not quite steady, telling herself correctly that a man of that rank has been trained since infancy to acknowledge every woman who crosses his path, and that it means precisely nothing at all. Her aunt came up at 7. "He asked who you were," said Mrs. Dallimore. "I am very sorry." He asked twice. Her aunt stood in the middle of the schoolroom, looking at the map of the Holy Land on the wall. "I told him you were my late husband's niece, who lives here. Understand me, Nell, a man like that has excellent manners and no interest whatsoever, and the two things look identical from where you are standing. Do not learn the difference from him. Learn it from me now, and save yourself. Yes, ma'am. Sophia will be a duchess in 9 weeks. Yes, ma'am." Her aunt went out and shut the door, and Nell sat down and did the household book, and made no mistakes in it, which she was rather pleased about. Nicholas Carrick, Duke of Marchbourne, was 34 years old, and had been the Duke for 3 of them. He had not been raised for it. He had been the younger son, which in that family meant 6 years abroad on an allowance that was generous the way a bribe is generous, most of them in Rome, looking at pictures and learning to be alone, and happy in a way he could never explain to an Englishman. Then his brother came off a horse in a ditch at Marchbourne, and did not get up, and a letter found Nicholas in February, and he came home to a black hung house, a mother he had written to twice in 6 years, 400 people who depended on him, and a promise his father had made at a dinner table when Nicholas was a boy. There was no deed and no bond, only a debt of honor, plain and unenforceable and absolute. He had gone up to London and told the Dallimores' man of business that he considered himself bound by it, and had come away lighter, because a life you have not chosen is at least a life somebody has settled. He was thought cold in that county, and proud. What he actually was a man who had spent 6 years not needing to speak, who had come back to a country where every sentence he said was repeated in 20 houses by Friday, and who had answered that by saying almost nothing. When he was uncertain, he was silent. When he was moved, he was silent. He had a face that gave nothing away, because the giving had never been taught to it. That night, riding home in the rain, he was thinking about a girl in a dark green gown, coming down a staircase with a larder key in her hand, saying, "Don't help me. I've got you to a bleeding boy." In the middle of the most carefully arranged afternoon he had ever been the object of. He had risen. That wants saying properly, because it is the whole seed of this. He had not been sitting. He had been standing in a hall with his hat in his hand. But something in him had come up on its feet all the same, and he had done the only outward thing there was to do, which was to bow his head to a woman that everybody else in the room was waiting for the removal of. He met his intended bride an hour later and found her lovely, frightened, and about as glad to see him as a girl is glad to see a debt collector. He was sorry for her, and said so in a stiff, kind, badly chosen sentence that made her laugh at him. He was to dine there twice in the week. He had already begun, without admitting it to himself, to look forward to Tuesdays. March at Wexham Priors went by in a pattern that everyone in the house could have recited by the middle of it. Tuesdays and Fridays the Duke came. He sat in the drawing-room for an hour and 40 minutes with Sophia and her mother and whichever neighbours had contrived to be calling. He asked Sophia about her music, and Sophia played, beautifully and furiously, and he thanked her. He walked with her twice round the wet gravel with a footman at a decent distance, and they spoke, according to Sophia, about the roads. And then, quite regularly, at about the point where the light began to go, the Duke of Marchbourne would remember a book. It was always a book. He had heard that the late Mr. Ferrers of Aldenbury had left a collection here. He had a curiosity about a particular edition. He would not dream of troubling anybody. And Mrs. Dallimore, who could see a thing coming from a long way off but could not see this, because it did not fit anything she had ever had to prevent before, said that of course he must go through, and that she would send someone. The someone was always Nell, because there was nobody else who knew where anything was. The first time, she found him in front of her father's shelves in the last of the light, reading the spines, and she told him where the Livy was, and left. The second time he asked her what the pencil notes in the margins meant, and she said they were her father's arguments with people who had been dead for 1800 years, and that he had generally lost. The third time she was up the library steps with a book in each hand when he came in, and she said, without looking round, "It is on the top shelf and it is under the wrong letter, because my father filed by how much he liked a man, not by his name." And behind her the Duke of Marchbourne laughed. Cleghorn heard it from the passage and mentioned it in the servants' hall, and the housekeeper said he must have been told a joke, and Cleghorn, who had been 40 years in service, and had a fine ear for these things, said no. He said it was the other kind. He said it was the kind a man does not decide to do. Nell did not decide anything either. She simply found over the weeks that she was talking. She told him about the parsonage at Aldenbury, and the 11 days, and about her father, who had once given away the parlor fire irons and could not afterwards remember to whom. He told her about Rome, which he had never described to anybody in England, because in England describing Rome makes you a bore or a papist. He told her about the exact quarter of an hour in which he had understood that his brother was dead, and his own life had been given away to somebody else's arrangements, and how the thing he felt first, before any grief at all, was a shameful and enormous relief that he would no longer have to invent a reason to exist. He had never said that to a living soul. He said it to a woman on a library step in a made-over green gown, on a Friday, in the cold, with his intended bride's family in the room next door. "That is not shameful," said Nell. "That is only true. You are allowed to have had a feeling before the right one arrived." There was a fair-sized silence. "Miss Ferrers," said the Duke, "why do you not dine?" "Because the table is arranged, Your Grace." "You know that is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have got," said Nell, and came down the steps and gave him his book, and went out and stood in the passage with her hand flat on the cold plaster for a while, and then went up and heard Georgie's Latin. Sophia saw it before anybody. Of course she did. She had the most at stake, and the sharpest eyes in that house. She came up to the attic floor at the end of March, which she had never done, and sat on the end of Nell's bed with her hair down her back and said, "He is in love with you," in the flat voice of somebody reading out a weather report. "He is not. Don't. I am not angry with you. I am too tired to be angry with you." Sophia pulled a thread out of the counterpane. "He is kind to me. Do you know how much worse that makes it? If he were a brute, I could be a martyr about it. He is kind, and he is bored, and he is going to be kind and bored at me for 40 years, and my mother is going to be the woman whose daughter is a duchess. And there is a lieutenant in the 16th called Peter Sandal who wrote to me at Christmas, and I burnt it, and I have thought about that letter every day since." Nell did not say any of the 4 or 5 things she wanted to say. "Say something," said Sophia. "If I say the true thing, you will hate me for it in the morning." "Very probably." Sophia stood up and went to the door and stopped there with her hand on it. "Nell, when it comes, and it is coming, do not be brave in front of my mother. Be brave anywhere else you like, not in front of her. Mrs. Dallimore did not accuse anybody of anything. That was never her method. Accusation puts a thing into words, and a thing in words can be argued with. She preferred to remove the ground it stood on and let it fall down by itself. So in the first week of April, the library at Wexham Priors was locked. It was done for an excellent reason. The damp had got into the north wall, and the books were to be looked at by a man from Norwich. The key lived in Mrs. Dallimore's workbox, and on Tuesdays and Fridays, the medicine basket now went down to the cottages, which it had never once done on those 2 afternoons before, so that Nell was generally coming up the drive with her boots ruined at about the hour the Duke's horses were brought round. Nell understood every part of this within about 4 days, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not have begun a war she could not win, and because a good deal of it was, in the strictest sense, kindness. Her aunt was trying to prevent a catastrophe, and was right about what the catastrophe would be. The Duke asked that Friday, at dinner, in front of 14 people. He did it badly, which is the only reason it was survivable. He waited until the second course and then said, in the flattest voice in the world, Mrs. Dallimore, Miss Ferrers does not dine with us. The table did that thing a table does. Nobody looked up. She does not, said Mrs. Dallimore pleasantly. Is she unwell? She is perfectly well, Your Grace. She prefers it. And there it was, 3 words, unanswerable, delivered with a small courteous smile over the fish. To go on, the Duke would have had to say out loud, at his intended bride's mother's table, that he did not believe her, and the only reason a man does that is a reason he could not name and remain an honourable man for 5 more minutes. He looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable, then said, I see, and turned to the woman on his left and asked her about the drainage. Mrs. Dallimore had won, and knew she had won, and did not enjoy it in the least. She went up to her own room afterwards and sat for some time without a candle. The next morning she told Nell about Cheltenham. There was a Mrs. Prowse, a widow of good family and indifferent temper, who required a companion. The place was arranged. The letters had been going backwards and forwards for a month. Nell would have her own room, and her keep and her Sundays, and there were worse lives. When? Said Nell. The 6th of May, said her aunt, the day after the wedding. The carriage will take you to the mail at Norwich. Yes, ma'am. You are not to write to this house for a year. Nell heard herself say, yes, ma'am, a 3rd time, and then went up to the attic floor and stood at the window that would not open, looking at the rooks going over the elms, and did the only useful thing she knew how to do, which was to take the whole of it out and look at it plainly. She was going to Cheltenham. She would read aloud to a woman she had never met for perhaps 20 years, and then that woman would die and there would be another. That was her life, and had been since the 11 days at the parsonage, and nothing that had happened in a cold library in March had altered it by so much as an hour. The other thing, the thing she would not let herself put a name to, was not a possibility that had been taken away from her. It had never been a possibility. Nothing had been stolen. You cannot be robbed of a house you were never inside. She was very calm about all of it, and she cried for about 1.5 minutes, standing up with her fist against her mouth, and then washed her face and went down and heard Georgie's Latin, and Georgie said she was not listening, and he was right. The last conversation happened on the Tuesday, in the passage outside the locked library, and lasted perhaps 4 minutes. He had come to find her, that was plain from the way he arrived, too fast, out of the drawing room, with no book to be an excuse. Miss Ferrers, I am going up to town on Thursday for a week. I hope you have a pleasant journey, Your Grace. I am going, he said, to see whether a thing can be undone. Nell stood with her back against the locked library door and looked at a point somewhere near his collar. Don't, she said. You have not heard what I mean to say. I have heard it. It is why I am asking you not to say it. Her voice, she noticed with some distant satisfaction, was entirely steady. If you say it in this house, 2 things can happen. Either you are a man who broke his father's word, and everything anybody has ever said about your family in this county becomes true, and your children carry it after you. Or you say it, and nothing changes, and I am put on the Norwich mail on Thursday morning instead of the 6th of May. So do not put it into words, because words are the thing here that cannot be taken back. He was silent for a while. He was very good at that. You are asking me to do nothing, he said. I am asking you not to speak. Those are not the same thing. No, said Nell, they are not. And that is where it should have ended, and would have, except that he did not go. He stood in the cold passage with the rain going across the window at the end of it, and said, in the tone of a man setting an object down carefully so that it will still be there later, at Marchbourne there is a chair at the head of the long table. Black oak, older than the house, with the arms worn pale where 4 generations have put their hands. My father sat in it every night of my childhood. My brother sat in it for 11 months. I have sat in it for 3 years, and I have never once sat down in it without thinking that I am in somebody else's place, and that the room knows it. Why are you telling me that? I have no idea, said the Duke of Marchbourne. I have told you a great many things I do not tell people, and I have stopped trying to account for it. Then he bowed to her and went back to the drawing room, and was to marry nobody for another 29 days, and Nell stayed in the passage with her hands flat against the library door behind her until she could trust her legs. He was in London for 9 days, and I can tell you exactly what he did there, because he told Nell afterwards. He went first to the lawyers, and the lawyers were delighted. There was no bond, no settlement executed, no instrument of any kind that could be produced before any tribunal in England. As a matter of law, he could have walked away from the whole arrangement on a wet Wednesday, and no power on earth could have laid a finger on him. He asked them what the county would say. They said carefully that the county would say the present Duke of Marchbourne had taken a dead tradesman's money in a bad year, and repudiated a dead man's word in a good one, in the month he was to be married, and that everything else ever said about him would be said around that. He then did the only decent thing available, which was to ask the Dallimores' man of business plainly whether Miss Dallimore might wish to be released. The answer came back within the day over Mrs. Dallimore's own signature, 2 lines long and perfectly polite, that Miss Dallimore was sensible of the honour, that she had no wish whatever to be released, and that her mother had the pleasure of assuring his grace of her daughter's continued devotion. Sophia was never asked. She never saw that answer and did not know it existed. She learned of it in the last hour of the last night of April, in a room with the whole county in it, and what she did about it belongs further on. That was the week the whole thing came apart at Wexham Priors, and it did not come apart because of the Duke at all. Lieutenant Peter Sundell of the 16th was staying at his aunt's house at Burnham, 9 miles off, and on the Wednesday of that week he rode over to Aldenbury and stood in the churchyard for an hour and a half in a wind that would strip paint, and Sophia went to him. Nell did not carry a letter. It matters that this is said clearly, because it was afterwards said in the county that she did. What Nell did was worse and better than that. She was in the yard when Sophia came back through the shrubbery, with her hem soaked to the knee and her face like a lamp, and she saw her face, and walked her in by the still-room door, and put her by the fire, and got the wet stockings off her, and told the kitchen that Miss Dallimore had turned her ankle on the gravel. She lied for her. That was all. It took perhaps 40 seconds, and she did it without deliberating, in the way you put your hand out to catch a falling glass. And on the Friday Mrs. Dallimore found a letter in Sophia's writing case that had not been burnt. She did not shout. She read it standing at the window in her daughter's bedroom, then folded it and put it in her pocket, and turned round and said to Sophia, "Who took this to the post?" Sophia said nothing. Sophia was 20 years old and terrified, and had been raised by that woman. Who took it? And after a silence that Sophia paid for privately for the rest of her life, Sophia said, Nell, it was not true. Nell had never touched it, and could have proved it inside of 10 minutes if anybody had wanted it proved. Nobody wanted it proved, because a household under that much strain does not want the truth. It wants an arrangement it can go on living in. Mrs. Dallimore came to the schoolroom at 9 that evening. Nell was cutting a pen for Georgie. You carried a letter from my daughter to a man. Nell put the pen down. Here is the thing she understood. In the second or so she had to understand it in. If she said no, it would be her word against Sophia's, and Sophia would be made to repeat it, and would repeat it, because she could do nothing else with her mother in the room, and the girl would carry that for 40 years. If she said nothing at all, it would be over in a minute, and the only person damaged would be a woman who was going to Cheltenham on the 6th of May, regardless. I have nothing to say about it, ma'am, said Nell. Her aunt looked at her for a long moment, and something went across that dry, controlled, capable face that was not triumph. You have been a fool, said Mrs. Dallimore, and I have been kinder to you than the world will ever be, and this is what it earns. You will not sit with Sophia again. You will not be alone with Georgie. You will come to Marchbourne on the 30th because it would be remarked upon if you did not, and you will stand where you are put, and after that you will go. No, ma'am. Have you nothing else to say to me, at all? Only that I am sorry, said Nell, for a great many things, but not for that, which her aunt took as a confession, and which it was not. The Duke came back from London on the 17th. He came back to a country that had, in 9 days, made up its mind about something. He noticed it before he was off his horse, in the way the grooms did not look at him, and in a letter from Mrs. Ludlow of Barton inviting him to dine, which carried a postscript about the sad necessity of firmness with dependents. He rode over on the Tuesday. Sophia was pale, and could not meet his eye. Mrs. Dallimore was flawless. Miss Ferrars, he was told, was helping in the linen room, and could not be spared, and there is no reason on earth for a duke to require the attendance of a poor relation, and he knew it, and he sat there with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, understanding for the first time in his life what it is to have no power of any kind whatsoever. He did not see her again before the 30th. That was managed. It was managed extremely well. But he did see her once across the width of the Aldenbury Road on the Sunday, walking back with the basket in the rain, and he pulled up his horse, and she gave the very smallest shake of her head. Do not. Not here. There is nothing you can do here that does not cost me, and walked on past his stirrup, with the rain coming off the brim of her bonnet. He sat in the road for a while after she had gone round the bend. Then he rode home to Marchbourne Court, and went into the great dining-room, which was being got ready for the whole of that county, and stood at the head of the long table, with his hand on the pale worn arm of the black oak chair. And he stood there long enough that the housekeeper came in twice, and went out again both times without saying anything at all. The last week of April at Wexham Priors was the quietest week that house ever had. Nobody spoke about anything. The wedding clothes came from Norwich in 2 boxes, and were unpacked upstairs in silence. Sophia did not come down for 2 days, and was said to have a headache. Mrs. Dallimore went about her business, exactly as she always had, and looked, to anybody who had not known her a long while, entirely well. Nell's own box stood packed on the attic landing from the Monday, because there would be no time on the 6th of May, and because a thing that is packed early stops being frightening and becomes only a box. Georgie found her sitting on the top stair beside it on the Wednesday evening. He did not have the words, so he used the ones he had, which were, "Is that your box?" "It is." "Are you coming back?" "No, my love." Georgie thought about that with his chin on his knees. Then he said, "Who's going to do my Latin?" And then, without any warning at all, he put his forehead down on her shoulder and cried in the furious, ashamed way that boys of that age cry. And Nell sat on the top stair with her arm round him and told him a great many things about Cheltenham that were not true. That was the only time she was properly undone. She would like that on the record. On the Thursday, after the house was shut, Cleghorn came up the back stairs, which he had never once done in 4 years, with a candle in one hand and her father's Herodotus in the other, parlor fire smell and argumentative pencil and all. She never asked him where he got the key to a locked library. He was 40 years in that house, and he had heard a duke laugh through a shut door, and he risked his whole living on one turn of a key, and nobody ever thanked him for that either. Friday the 30th came in warm and still, the first real day of the spring, with the May out in the hedges along the Marchbourne road, and the light going on till past 8. The Dallimores went over in the closed carriage at 6, Mrs. Dallimore in grey silk, Sophia in white, her hair done for 2 hours by a woman brought from Norwich for the purpose. Nell went in the second carriage with the boxes and Sophia's maid, and got down at the side of the court, and was taken in by a door the family never used. She had her green gown, made over twice and turned once and pressed that afternoon by a housemaid who did it without being asked, and would not be thanked for that either. She looked, and knew she looked, exactly like what she was. Marchbourne Court was a mile of avenue, and then a great pale front with every window in it lit, lamps set along the terrace in the still air, and a line of carriages coming up behind them all the way back to the lodge. Nell had never seen anything like it, and did not pretend to herself that she had. She was put in a corridor. That is not unkindness on anybody's part. It is simply what happens to a person of her exact station at an occasion of that size. She was to be within call of Sophia, in case of a torn flounce or a fainting, and so she was given a hard chair in a stone-floored passage behind the great hall, where she could hear the whole thing going on through the wall like weather in another country. Doors, feet, a fiddle being tuned, laughter, more carriages. She sat there with her hands in her lap for the best part of an hour, and was, on the whole, all right. The Dowager Duchess of Marchbourne found her at about 7:30. Honoria Carrick was 70 years old, had buried a husband and a son, and had been the most feared woman in that county for 30 years before Mrs. Dallimore was ever heard of. She was small and upright, and dressed in black with a great deal of very old lace, and she was deaf in the left ear and made no secret of it, and she went about her own house on her own feet. She came round the corner of the passage, stopped, and looked at the young woman on the hard chair for rather a long time. "You are the Ferrers girl." Nell stood up. "Yes, ma'am. Your Grace. Sit down again, I am not the Queen." The Dowager lowered herself into the second chair, with the particular care of somebody whose hips have opinions. "Why are you in my passage?" "I am within call of my cousin, your Grace. That is what you have been told to say. I asked why you are in my passage." There was a pause of some length. "Because I carried a letter from my cousin to a man she is not to marry," said Nell, "and my aunt has withdrawn her countenance from me, and I am to go into a situation at Cheltenham on the 6th of May. The dowager turned her head so as to bring the good ear round. Say that again. Nell said it again. Said the Dowager Duchess. And then, after a silence in which somewhere beyond the wall a great many people laughed at something I have been lied to by professionals for 50 years. My husband, my elder son, God rest him. 3 bishops. You are not good at it. You said I carried a letter the way a person says a line she has learned, and you looked at the middle of my forehead while you said it. Nell said nothing at all. I shall not ask you again, because you would only tell it me again, and I find I would rather not watch you do that. The old woman got herself up, refused the arm that Nell put out, and stood a moment, settling her lace. How long have you been sitting in this passage? An hour, perhaps, Your Grace. And do you know how long my son has been standing at the door of the yellow drawing-room, greeting the whole of this county with his back to the room, so that he can see down that corridor there, which comes out at the end of yours? Nell looked at the stone floor. About an hour, said the Dowager Duchess of Marchbourne, and went away down the passage in her old lace, considerably faster than she had come up it. They went in to supper at 10. The great dining room was got up that night the way a house of that age gets itself up perhaps 4 times in a century. The long table down the middle, under 3 lit chandeliers, laid for 26, which was the family and the principal people of that county. And beyond the arch, in the gallery, small tables for everybody else, so that something like 90 people were at supper within sight of the head of the long table. At the head of the long table was the black oak chair, and in it was the Duke of Marchbourne. On his right was Sophia Dallimore in white, being looked at by 90 people. On his left was the Dowager Duchess, eating almost nothing and missing almost nothing. Halfway down on her daughter's side sat Mrs. Augusta Dallimore in grey silk, at the exact centre of the most successful evening of her life. And in the stone passage on the other side of the wall, Nell Ferrers sat on a hard chair and listened to the noise change as 90 people sat down. It was Mrs. Ludlow of Barton who did it, out of ambition, which is a duller motive than malice and does more damage in the world. Mrs. Ludlow had 4 unmarried daughters, and a place in that county that depended entirely on being seen to be intimate with Mrs. Dallimore, and she had spent the whole week explaining to the neighbourhood that she had known from the first that the Ferrers girl was sly. At about 11:15, in a lull with a glass in her, she leaned out from her place and said, down the length of that table, in a bright, social voice that carried into the gallery, Mrs. Dallimore, is it true you have had to put your niece out of the house? The lull went absolute. Mrs. Dallimore did not hesitate, because hesitation would have been an admission that there was anything to hesitate about. My niece goes into a situation at Cheltenham on the 6th of May, she said. It is a very good place, and she is fortunate in it. Yes, but is it true, said Mrs. Ludlow, about the letters? And there it was, out on the table, under the chandeliers, in front of the whole of that county and a duke and a duke's mother. What Mrs. Dallimore should have done, and would have done 6 months earlier, was to put it away with a bored sentence. But her daughter would not look at her. The Duke had written to her man of business. There was a letter in her own writing case, over her own signature, saying that Sophia had no wish to be released, composed without asking Sophia anything at all. Somewhere under all of it, a woman of 50 odd was extremely frightened, and had decided without ever putting it into words that the safest place for the blame was on the person least able to carry it anywhere. "There was a letter," said Mrs. Dallimore. "It was carried to a gentleman by a member of my household. The matter is closed, and I would be obliged if it were not spoken of at His Grace's table." Which was, of course, the precise opposite of closing it. And she knew it, and she said it anyway. "Where is she?" said Mrs. Ludlow, "beyond the hall, I imagine." "Well, I should like to hear it from her," said Mrs. Ludlow of Barton, and turned round in her chair and told a footman to fetch the young person in. The footman looked at Mrs. Ludlow. Then he looked at the head of the table, because he was a Marchbourne servant, and Mrs. Ludlow of Barton was nothing to him whatever, and he waited for the Duke. The Duke of Marchbourne said, "Fetch Miss Ferrers." He said it quietly, and the county argued for a year and a half about what he meant by it, half of them sure he had said it in order to have her humiliated, and half in order to have her brought in. Only one man knew, and he never told anybody but her. So Nell was brought in. She came through the door at the foot of the great dining room in a made-over green gown, with her hair done plainly, into 3 chandeliers, and 26 faces at the long table, and 60 more turning round in the gallery, and stopped where the footman stopped, with the whole length of that table in front of her, and the Duke of Marchbourne at the far end of it. She did not look at him. That was deliberate, and it cost her everything she had. "Come nearer, child. Nobody can hear you," said Mrs. Ludlow, and Nell came 4 steps and stopped again. "Did you carry a letter from Miss Dallimore to Lieutenant Sandal?" "I have nothing to say about it, ma'am. That is not an answer." "No, ma'am," said Nell. "It is not." Somebody in the gallery laughed and stopped. Mrs. Ludlow came halfway up out of her chair, a large woman in a great deal of puce satin, with her glove in her fist and her arm out down the table, and one gloved finger extended the whole way at the girl standing at the end of it, and she said, "You have been given a home out of pure charity by the best woman in this county, and you have paid for it by making mischief between a duke and his promised wife, and everybody in this room knows exactly what you were after, and you may thank God you are only being sent to Cheltenham." And Nell Ferrers stood at the foot of the table with her hands at her sides and let it go over her, and did not weep, and did not answer, and looked at the middle of the tablecloth, and thought, with a clarity she was ashamed of afterwards, that it would be over in a minute, and that the box was already packed on the attic landing. Nobody spoke. The butler, who had stood at the sideboard through the whole of it, said into that silence, in the low, flat voice of a servant putting a fact on a table, because his conscience will not let him hold it any longer, your grace, "There is no place laid." "No," said Mrs. Dallimore, without turning her head. "There is not." She does not sit down, and 90 people waited to see what a duke would do about a poor relation standing at the wrong end of his dining room, and the honest answer, which everyone in it knew, was that a duke does nothing about a thing like that, because there is nothing to be done about it that does not cost more than any man has. The Duke of Marchbourne put his napkin on the table beside his plate, folded once, the way you do when you are coming back, and stood up out of the black oak chair. There was nothing dramatic in it. That is the first thing everyone who was there always said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Mrs. Ludlow then or ever again in his life. He simply pushed the great chair back with the flat of his hand, and the boards were bare there under the head of the table, and the sound of it went the whole length of that room and into the gallery, and 90 people heard a chair move. Then he walked down the side of his own dining table, past 26 people, in front of all of them, without hurrying and without stopping, the whole length of the room. It took perhaps 12 seconds. Nobody in that house had seen the Duke of Marchbourne cross a room like that in the 3 years he had held the title, because a man of his rank does not go to people. People are brought to him. The distance between the head of a table and the foot of it is not a distance in feet and inches. It is the entire architecture of who owes what to whom. It is walked in one direction only. And everybody at that supper had been taught that before they were 7 years old. He walked it the wrong way, and he did it in his own house, with the county watching, 5 days before his wedding. He stopped in front of Nell Ferrers. She had to look up at him then. Whatever was on her face, it was not gratitude. She was not a woman who had ever expected anything, and she did not know yet what was happening. The Duke of Marchbourne held out his hand to her, palm up, and said, quietly, so that it went no further than the two of them and the footman. And the footman kept it for 9 years, and then told it once, at his own daughter's wedding, and wept, "Don't help me. I've got you." And Nell Ferrers, who had said that to a bleeding child on a staircase in March, in front of a man she had never seen before, put her hand in his. He walked her up the length of that table. Not on his arm, which is what a gentleman does with a lady he is taking in to supper. By the hand, which is what nobody does with anybody in a room with 90 people in it. Past Mrs. Ludlow, past her aunt in grey silk, who did not turn her head, past the whole of that county, in her made-over green gown, with the chandeliers going over her one after another. At the head of the table he stopped, and turned the black oak chair out from the table with his own hands, and stood holding the back of it. And Nell said, under her breath, "Your Grace, I can't." And he said, "You can," and she sat down in it. The chair that was older than the house. The chair with the arms worn pale by 4 generations of Marchbournes, that his father had sat in every night of his childhood, and his brother had sat in for 11 months, and that he had never once sat down in without feeling that the room knew he was in somebody else's place. Then he pushed it in for her, the way you do, and straightened up behind it, and stayed on his feet. The butler moved, the fastest anybody had seen that man move in 20 years, because the obvious thing, the thing that would have let everybody off, was for a second chair to be brought to the head of the table, so that the Duke might sit down beside her and the evening resume. "No," said the Duke of Marchbourne. "Thank you. I shall stand." There is a rule about this, and it is very old and perfectly simple, and it is not a courtesy but a piece of plumbing. Nobody sits while the host is standing. Every person in that room had it in their bones, and the Duke of Marchbourne stood at the head of his own table with his hands on the back of the chair he had given away, and did not sit down, and did not mean to, and everybody understood inside of about 4 seconds that he would stand there until the candles went out. The Dowager Duchess of Marchbourne got up first. She was 70, and it hurt her to do it, and she did it without touching the table, and stood there in her old black lace beside her son. Then Sophia Dallimore, in white, at the Duke's right hand, stood up. Then, in ones and twos, and then in a rush, the long table, and then the gallery, 60-odd people who could not see properly, and stood up anyway because everybody else had. By 11:30 on the last night of April, there were something like 90 people on their feet at supper, with the food going cold, because a duke would not sit down while a girl in a made-over gown sat in his chair. Mrs. Augusta Dallimore was the last. She sat alone at the middle of that long table for a moment everybody present remembered for the rest of their lives, with her back straight and her hands flat on the cloth. Then she stood up too, because she could not be the only person in that room sitting, and because whatever else she was a woman who had spent 50 years knowing exactly what a room required of her. Nell watched her aunt's hands come up off the cloth, and saw that they were not steady, and found she was not glad about it, and never was afterwards. That is the whole of it, and it is worth being plain about what it cost. It cost him nothing that could be counted, not a penny, not an acre, not a signature. What he spent was the only thing he actually owned, his standing in a county where his family had been the first name for 400 years, 5 days before he was to marry another woman, over a girl who had been publicly named a mischief maker 10 minutes earlier, and who could give him nothing back. And what it did, in the end, was not to Nell at all. It was to Sophia. Because Sophia Dallimore stood at that table with her hands shaking, and looked down the length of it at the man she was to marry on Wednesday, standing behind a chair with somebody else in it, and before midnight she asked him whether it was true that he had written to her people to ask if she might be released. He told her the truth, that he had, and that the answer had come back over her mother's signature. Sophia said, "I was never asked." "No," said the Duke of Marchbourne. "I see that now." She did not make a scene. She was her mother's daughter, and she went out to the terrace and stood in the warm dark for a while by herself. But the next morning, in the hall at Wexham Priors, in front of Cleghorn and 2 housemaids and her own mother, Sophia Dallimore said 3 things without stopping: that she released the Duke of Marchbourne from every part of his father's promise, and would say so to anybody who asked, that Nell Ferrers had never carried any letter of hers anywhere, and that she had posted it herself and let her mother believe otherwise, and that she was going to write to Lieutenant Peter Sandal that afternoon, and did not care who read it. Then she went upstairs and was sick, and then she came down and did all 3. The 5th of May came, and went without a wedding, and the county talked of nothing else for a year and a half, and got most of it wrong. Nell did not go to Cheltenham. Mrs. Prowse of that town was written to on the 3rd of May, in Nell's own careful hand, with the deepest apologies, and the box came down off the attic landing, and was carried into the 3rd best bedroom on the floor below by Georgie Dallimore, who dropped it twice on the stairs from pure joy, and had to be spoken to. Between Nell and her aunt there was never a reconciliation of the kind that gets into stories. There was a conversation in the morning room in the first week of May, and it was short, and neither of them apologized, and at the end of it Mrs. Dallimore said, "I did what I knew," and Nell said, "I know you did," and that was the peace they made, and it held for the rest of their lives. The Duke of Marchbourne came over the day after the 5th of May, and brought nothing with him, and they walked down the wet gravel with a footman at a decent distance, and what was said there is not the property of this or any other story. They were married at Aldenbury in September, in her father's church, with Georgie holding the door and Cleghorn in the 3rd pew on the north side, and the Dowager Duchess of Marchbourne telling a bishop loudly that she had known the whole thing in a passage in April. And at Marchbourne Court, at the head of the long table, There were from that night onwards 2 chairs, where there had always been one. The black oak chair, with the arms worn pale, and beside it a plain one, brought up out of some other room, and never taken away again. So that for the rest of that house's history there was always, at that table, 1 chair too many.